Hi, and welcome to another Can It Be Done in React Web? For this one, I'm going to again be doing something that's been done on Can It Be Done in React Native. Um, haven't actually found a standalone thing, just the video from here, because I don't actually have an iOS phone and the Android one doesn't have this. Um, so we're looking at this tabbing system, and if we just watch the video a bit, as you scroll the lower half, the indicator at the top scrolls across, and also you can click on the indicator at the top to jump to the next one. And we've got this really cool masking effect at the top where we're making it be dark when we've got the light background, but light when we've got the dark background. And it's really smooth and joined up with the lower half, and you can't stop scrolling halfway in between. So what this is going to end up with looking like in our version, again I'm going horizontal, but this could equally work vertically, which might make more sense in a web app. So I've got 4 tabs. We'll start with 3 and then extend to that. And as we scroll across, we can see that masking at the top is working really nicely. So the TV picture is currently, and phone pictures are both half white, half black as the pink goes across. I've gone for pink and blue rather than light and dark, but it doesn't make any difference. And it's all buttery smooth because this is just using normal scrolling. And then when I release my scroll, I jump to the nearest stop with a bit of allowance for momentum. So to dive straight into this, this is what I've prepared with as a starting point for the project. You can see what this produces on the right. So we can scroll across. My pages are really boring, just have a border and a word in, but I don't think the page content's really too critical. And then at the top we've got our tab bar, but at the moment no link between that and the scrolling. If we go and look at what we've got doing this in code, again as normal I've started with create React app, added style components, React Spring, React use gesture, and converted a load of the stuff from CSS from the original Create React app into style components. So at the top level we just have the app, which is just the pager. So we have a container for the overall thing, which is taking up the whole height of the window, and then the content at the bottom is this scrolling container, horizontal scrolling container, so overflow x scroll, and content page is what is currently housing each of these bottom halves. So we have a content scrollable with 3 content pages, and then at the top we've got a tab bar with 3 tabs in. I'm just using Material UI for the icons. If we look at the tab bar, at the moment it's just a style component, standard bit of CSS, fixed height, fixed width, border radius to give the rounded corners, and each tab is again just a styled component with a right border to provide the black line, apart from on the last one. We don't have a right hand border. So that's what we've got to begin with. When we look at breaking this down, going to want to do the masking at the top, the scroll jumping, and then link the 2 up. Going to start with what is potentially the easiest one, which is the scroll jumping, because if we when we link it up, we should get the scrolling on the top correctly linking up to the the three stops on the bottom. So for this one, we've got two options. We could manually write JavaScript to spring back to the particular points, but if we want that to feel nice and take into account momentum and stuff, that's going to be quite complicated. Fortunately, there is a relatively new CSS property that can help us out here. So it's the CSS scroll snap. It's pretty widely supported now. So we're up at almost 90%, or over 85% if we're not using the prefixed versions. But you don't really have full support for. You've got enough support for what we need if we have prefixing for IE 10 and 11, and the same for Edge. But in other more modern desktop browsers, we're looking pretty good. So if we go and look at the MDN documentation for this, I'd never used this until I used it here. So we had the key properties being snap type and scroll snap align. So the type is on the scroll container, and snap align is on the child elements. And this example gives us a really good guide. So in this, we've got example. We can see it's snapping, and that's exactly the behavior we want. So we've got scroll snap type Y mandatory. So Y being the axis, we're going to want ours to be X, but mandatory to say that we must always end up stopped at one of our stops. And on each individual section, we need to tell it that when we snap to that section, we want to snap to the start of that section. So this should be pretty easy here. So on the scroll container, which is content, we want that, and on each content page, we want to snap them all to the start of the page, start of the element. And so when it first reloaded, it didn't quite know, because the browser triggers this at the point when you finish scrolling, rather than if you update halfway through. But that was just because it was already loaded. And so we can see it's happily snapping, taking into account momentum. Quite difficult for you to tell what I'm doing. I'm doing it on the touchpad. But that seems to have handled that quite nicely. For the browsers where it's not supported, there is a polyfill that you can use if you need that. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to start looking at getting the masking on the tab bar to work, and then we're going to do the linking up of the two. So to do the masking of the tab bar, we're going to have two tab bars, one that is this blue one, and then another that is the pink one. And then we're only going to show the portion of the pink one that we actually want to see, using some masking or clipping. So just to make that easier before we start doing that, because we're going to want to duplicate these elements, I'm just going to try and abstract this into receiving this through as an array of tabs, and then the pager component understanding how to lay out the three different tabs. So if our tabs are as an array of icon, let's get all of these imports. And we've just got text in ours. We could have this being whatever content we actually wanted being passed in here. And the same for the other two. And pass those tabs into the pager. It should then cool. And then let's actually build this out with our actual tabs. Rather than creating the tabs in the pager, I'm going to give responsibility for that to the tab bar component. Which we'll go and sort out in a second. Let's add an ID to each of these. We can use as a consistent key. That's good practice. So we can get rid of our multiple calls to content page, and now we just need to tell tab bar what to do with some tabs. So rather than receiving children, it is now going to receive tabs, which is going to be an array of tab shape, which we're going to need to import. Should probably extract this to a separate file, so we don't have a circular import. Can we do that? Let's rename there. Let's save that for now. We can move that in a little while. Get our tab. And just tidy this up. and we have successfully managed to reproduce exactly the same thing. But now the tab bar only knows everything it needs to about how to render the tab bar for a set of tabs, rather than the pager having to do it for it. And so we can move on to the next step. So the next step is create two tab bars next to each other, and then put them on top of each other, and then only show part of one of them. So the first thing we want to do is create a container for our two tab bars. And so this is just going to be another div. Because we want this to work independently of what is containing our tab bar. So let's have this as position relative, because eventually we know we're going to want to put one on top of the other, and so we want the container for the two of them to be position relative. And let's just copy this for now. And we then have our two different tab rows. Next, let's make one of those be pink. So this is the syntax for extending. And let's make the background pale violet red, one of my favorites, and the foreground, so this will change the color of the icons. So now we have our pink one, which is going to be our overlay. So first thing we could do now would be to put it on top, which we can do with making both of these be position absolute. By doing that, we've now, because everything inside this container is position absolute, it's not reserving any space for itself, but we want it to just reserve the same amount of space as our rows themselves do. So we can copy the height and width, and that means that we're now putting them exactly where they were. I'm just going to take this out for a second, just so we can see a bit more of what we're doing while we're doing this. So the next thing we want to do is only show part of the pink one, and then when we put it on top of the blue one again, we'll see the blue one behind it. For now, I'm just going to do manually determining which bit we're going to show, and then later we'll link that up to the scrolling. So we can again do this with some CSS. So for the CSS, we're going to use a thing called clip path. Which allows us to only show part of an element. So parts that are inside the region are shown while those outside are hidden. So in our example, we're going to want to show the part of this corresponding to the active tab, and then which is going to be a rectangle. So if we go and look at the documentation again for this, if we want to do a rectangle, that is using the inset keyword. So to show just this first one to begin with, we're going to be in here. and we're using inset. And the parameters for this are like the margin or padding CSS parameters. So if you want to use all four option things, then it's top, right, bottom, left. So we'll go with that for clarity. So we always want to, we never want to clip any of the amount from the top, because once this is positioned over there, we want it up at the top. From the right, if we want to highlight the first one, we want to clip 2 times the tab width. That's in pixels. We never want to clip anything from the bottom, and we currently want to clip nothing from the left. So we can see we have nicely just clipped to the left-hand item. So if we put that back on top, there we go. And let's leave that for now. Let's take this and do, so what would it be for the second, to cover over the second item? So still 0 clipping from the top. Now we only want 1 tab width clipping from the right, 0 clipping from the bottom, but now 1 tab width of clipping from the left. So that should get us the middle one. And by extension, the last one, so we'd have 0 on the right and 2 tab widths on the left. And so if we just look at this from with thinking about how we're going to do this, so 2 tab widths, 1 tab width, 0 tab widths, 0 tab width, 1 tab width, 2 tab widths. So that is just going to be the, so 2 minus the index and the index times the tab width. So next thing we should do would be have some way of passing in the which tab is currently active. So we could do this in 2 different ways. We could just create a piece of state, either probably in the pager, for which is the active tab, and I think we'll start with that for now. Let's call these index and set active tab index. And let's pass these in to the tab bar. I'm currently putting them at page level because we're going to want something linking this to this being the tab bar to the lower scrolling, but for now we're just going to make it just work on the tab. Ooh, need to import use state. And then this is going to get unhappy that tab bar doesn't understand what these are. So active tab index is a number, and set active tab index is going to be a function which receives and returns void. So then we can pass this active tab index into our overlay row, because that's overlay row is the guy that's and then for generating this clip path, we are now going to be doing that with a calculation based on props. So clip path, inset 0. So we said that this was if so 2 minus the active tab index. So when the active tab index was 0, so we get the left one, we want this to be 2. And when it was the right one, so tab index 2, we would want this to be 0. So we want 2 minus active props dot active tab index times tab width, 0 for the bottom, and that's in pixels. And for this one, it is just active tab index times tab width. And again, that is pixels. Ooh, I appear to have got something wrong there. Let's go and have a look. We don't want that. Not there. We want the parent. We don't want that as a string. That's better. There we go. So now we do have the, because we're initializing state to 0, so we start with the left one, and then we want to make the tabs clickable. So let's give this an onClick handler. And we can now see that we are correctly changing that. And if we just add an animation to that, then we can see it is moving across with a nice animation, And so this works really nicely if all we're trying to do is link this to itself and have nice transitions between them. But this can only handle discrete active. Well, it can handle indiscrete, continuous active tab indexes. So if we say half, then we can initialize to halfway through. And so then we could write a listener to the scroll to be constantly updating this bit of state, and then re-rendering the tab bar with the new active tab index all the time. The problem with this is that it's not going to be performant, because for every single frame of scrolling on the bottom, we're going to need to trigger a complete re-render of the tab bar, because the active tab index prop is changing, and so we're going to have to go through update every time. And if you've watched the previous videos, you'll see we do have a way of bypassing the React render loop when we want to get better performance on this sort of thing. And the way we tend to do that is using React Spring. And we've seen before, React Spring has a nice companion library, React Use Gesture, which we can use to create a nice gesture handler. So if we're going to switch our component to use React Spring instead, the first thing we do is switch from using our use state to using use Spring, and rather than tracking the tab index, we're going to start with just tracking the scroll position, and then use that to calculate the tab index. So again, we want to initialize it to 0. Well, initialize the X scroll position to 0. And then to calculate the active tab index from that, we can interpolate the active tab index, interpolate the scroll position to, so from being up to 3 times the viewport width to being between 0 and 2. So the range of values that the scroll position could take would be from 0, being all the way to the left, to 2 times the viewport width. So at 0 when we're at the middle, when we're at the first one, at 1 times the scroll port width when we're at the second one, 2 times the viewport width when we're at the second one. So which we'll work out the viewport width in a second. And the output range that we want is, as we said, between, so just like we currently have for active tab index, we have from 0 to 2. So we can get rid of that now. I know for the moment that the viewport width of my current viewport on the side is 670 pixels. but we'll come back to that in a second. And then we need an equivalent of set active tab index. So we wanted this to receive an index as a number, and it is going to need to set the scroll position, set the x value of the scroll position to be, so if the index is 0, then we're going to want to set x to 0. If the index is 1, so we've clicked the middle one, we're going to want to set the scroll position to the middle. But we don't, we'll go with this for now for a moment. So this is index multiplied by viewport width. Need to import use Spring. It's a named export, not a default export. And we've broken it. So if we have a think about what our scroll position is now, so rather than being an actual active tab index, rather than being an actual number, it is an animated value. So an opaque interpolation of a number, rather than originally it was just an integer. So if we look in tab bar is currently still expecting a number and treating it in the same way, and so this is unsure what to do. So if we have a look at the inspector on this, the click path is getting 0, not a number, 0, not a number, because it's doing 2 times an object, and that is not a number. Or 2 minus not a number is not a number. So rather than this being a number, it is actually an opaque interpolation of a number, basically an animated value, rather than just being a number itself. But this isn't, and so now we should have this guy should start complaining that we're trying to pass something of the wrong type. And if you've watched any of the previous videos, when we want to convert use one of these interpolated numbers, we have to do a couple of things. So first of all, we need to make our style make a style or CSS that is what we actually want. So we're going to do this by providing a style prop, because that's how React Spring tends to work. So this is click path, the equivalent of this thing, and so now we're going to need to interpolate our active tab index. And so our range of input values we already know, because that is our range of indexes as we output from our interpolation here. So that is 0 to 2. And our output, we want this to be, we're going to use this to create our full set of insets. So at 0, we had our inset for 0 here. And at 1, at 2 even, at the other stop, we also calculated that already. And that means that we no longer need to be setting clip path here, and React Spring is also going to handle the animation for us. It's going to cycle through the different values, so we can get rid of the transition, which means that the overlay row no longer actually needs to receive the active tab index as a prop. But it does need our style. And the key thing is that we're no longer going to be triggering a re-render every time we scroll or change item, because we're going to have the same opaque interpolation object. So we're not actually doing a render, we're just going to be updating the value bypassing the rect render loop. And that's not quite going to work yet. So this seems to still be type checking all of the code that's commented out. So let's get rid of that. And now it's still not working. And if we go and look at this, it's not getting a valid style tag. And so what's going on there is when we're using one of these interpolated values style for our style, so rather than being a string, it's an opaque interpolation, we need to be using an animated div rather than just a plain div. So these are the guys that allow us to bypass the rect render loop. And we still want all of this CSS applied to our overlay row as well. So let's extract that out into a and then this can be really simple, and we can import it into both. So now we are correctly setting up our clip path, and we can see it's in here as it's as a inline style rather than being in CSS. Clicking does not currently work. Let's see, check that this is being called. Yep, we are calling it as I'd expect. So I guessing that we are calling set scroll position, so then we're just not interpolating properly. Okay, so when this is doing the interpolation, it's perfectly happy interpolating between 0 and 0, but it doesn't like interpolating between numbers with different units. So even though this is 0, it doesn't understand that at this point it's got pixels and at this point it's 0. So if we just give it 0 pixels as a helping nudge, then we've got back to where we were. Just get rid of this logging line. And so the key difference now is that rather than our use state version, which was triggering a complete render every time, we're bypassing React's render loop. So next thing we want to do is link the scrolling of the bottom half to the paging up here, and so that's bidirectional. So we want clicking up here to change the scroll position down here, and we want to change the scroll position down here to move the pink indicator. We'll start with the one that's more normal, I think. So this is, we want to trigger programmatic scrolling on the bottom half when we trigger our click. So to do that, anytime we want to do programmatic scrolling, we're thinking we probably want a ref and to trigger scroll to. So let's get a ref to the scroll container. Which is a div. Initialize it to null. Check that we import useRef. So let's pass this in as our ref. And then we need to programmatically trigger the scrolling on this guy. So that'd be content container dot current dot scroll to index. So we've already calculated where we want to scroll to. Let's try that. Oh, okay. Oh, there we go. TypeScript's caught up. Okay, because we initialize it to null. That's okay because we know that we only want to ever do the scrolling if it's already rendered. Let's try that. So that's a type guard. Doesn't seem happy with it. So the scroll to options, oh, it actually takes an object rather than just a parameter. What other options have we got? We have a behavior and we have a top. Top is optional, so we don't need to do that because we're never doing any scrolling in the Y direction. So let's go to behavior, and I think there is a smooth option. Yep. Let's try that. Oh, that's working. Working nicely. The only caveat with that is that it's only working nicely at this particular resolution. So if I change my viewport width, oh, it seems to stop working. And if why can't I? small, then I end up actually over scrolling when I go there, and that's because we've currently just got this viewport width as a fixed number, which happened to be the size of the viewport that I've been working on here. So measuring the width of the viewport, potentially if we were doing something different we might have a fixed width anyway, but for mine I'm going to use a hook that can measure the width. So we have one here, so this is use viewport sizes, measures the viewport width, so that seems exactly what we want. We're not expecting much in the way of viewport changing. We just need to make sure that we're measuring it. I suspect that we'll only ever measure it the first time. So let's get that import in, and if we look at the API again, so it's using array destructuring, and we only care about the first item, the width. TypeScript's unhappy because there isn't a type definition for this guy, but actual React code doesn't handle the actual change particularly nicely, but we could handle that if we wanted to. But we are correctly working at different viewport widths now. So the last thing that we wanted was to link the scrolling on the bottom half, and to get that to drive the pink indicator at the top. So for that we're going to need something to listen to the scroll events from content and use that to update our active tab index, which we get from our scroll position. So let's do that. For this we're going to use a library called React Use Gesture. It's from the React Spring guys, and here's an example. So use drag or use scroll, and it receives a callback that we can use with the set argument that we've got from our use Spring. We get a bind, and then we pass it into to a component. So and if we look at the API for this guy, it receives a whole thing of state, and the key that we're going to want is the XY, so the scroll position, which is for scroll position for use scroll, and then we do something with it. So we take XY, and then we are going to want to do much like we did here, update that animated value, and XY is an array of two numbers, the X coordinate and the Y coordinate, so we can just take the first one, and we need to import use scroll from React Use Gesture, and then pass that to here. And we can see we have it updating. TypeScript's unhappy because we don't have a type definition for use viewport size. But we can get rid of that for now just by turning down the strictness. And having restarted TypeScript, if I refresh now, it's happier. And you can see that it works. The only thing is if we do drag this, we can see there's a slight delay on the movement of the pink thing relative to the scroll position, and so that's because by default React Spring uses Spring Physics, but we can bypass that with the immediate flag. We want Spring Physics for the snapping, but we get some of that. Well, we get a nice enough animation of that as it is, but now it is really nicely coupled with our scrolling and our clicking. There's a weird flash, if you look carefully, of it scrolls directly to the position, or moves directly to the position and then moves back. And so what's going on there is that we're doing multiple set scroll pauses. So when we click the button, we trigger this set scroll position, which starts moving the pink thing to the new place. But then when we then do the actual scroll, that also then triggers our scroll listener, which then moves it to a slightly different place. We definitely want this because we want it to be listening to when it's scrolling, but we don't actually need this one. We can use this guy to automatically do this. So if we just get rid of the additional call to change the value, and we can see we've got rid of that flashing. So that's pretty much it for here. We've got that nice masking effect. Things that I'd think about doing in addition. So at the moment we're tracking scroll pos as our root animated value. I don't think we really need to be doing that. We could change that to be being active tab index and have this use scroll handler updating the index rather than interpolating twice. That would probably be slightly more performant. And in addition, at the moment, all of this is based on the assumption of us having 3 tabs. It would be pretty simple all the way through to find all of the places where we're currently making the assumption of 3 tabs. I think it's all in here. So where we're using 2 because that's the highest tab index. Just using using the tab count, so the length of the tab array, and the same here where we're using that. But I'm not going to go through that now because it's reasonably simple, normal React stuff. So that's all I've got for this Chrome tabs demo. Hope that you found it useful or enjoyed it, and let me know if you've got any thoughts in the comments.